Hello, my students. Before Spain was flamenco, football, and sunny streets. Before art, passion, and modern democracy. Spain was a land shaped by belief, power, and deep conflict. A land where faith decided identity, where empire promised greatness, and where disagreement often turned into struggle. Spain's story is not calm history. It is intense, emotional, contradictory, a story of kingdoms fighting for unity, of religion shaping power, and of a nation that paid a high price for silence. So stay with me until the very end, because this story is not only about Spain's past, it's about how conflict shapes identity, how faith can both protect and divide, and how a country learns painfully to choose dialogue over destruction. Let's begin this powerful journey together. Chapter 1. Spain's story begins long before it was called Spain, long before crowns, empires, or global ambition. It begins on a land shaped by crossings. The Iberian Peninsula sits between continents, seas, and civilizations, and from the very beginning, it was never meant to be isolated. Peoples arrived, settled, mixed, fought, and left traces behind. Iberians, Celts, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, each added a layer. Rome, in particular, left deep marks. Roads, cities, law, language. Latin became the root of Spanish identity long before Spain existed as a nation. But after Rome collapsed, certainty disappeared. Power fragmented. Kingdoms rose and fell. And then, in the 8th century, one of the most transformative moments in Spanish history arrived: the Islamic conquest. Muslim rulers from North Africa crossed into Iberia and established Al-Andalus, a civilization that would last for centuries. What followed was not a simple occupation, but a long, complex coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Cities like Córdoba, Toledo, and Granada became centers of learning, science, philosophy, and art. Knowledge flowed across languages and faiths. Spain, at this time, was one of the most advanced regions in Europe. Yet coexistence was never free of tension. Faith shaped identity deeply, and religion was never only spiritual, it was political. Power, belief, and belonging were inseparable. Over centuries, Christian kingdoms in the north slowly expanded southward in what became known as the Reconquista. This was not one war, but a long process filled with alliances, betrayals, coexistence, and conflict. The idea of Spain as a Christian kingdom was forming, but it was being built through struggle. By the late 15th century, a decisive moment arrived. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, unified large parts of the peninsula and completed the conquest of Granada in 1492. This year became symbolic, not only because Islamic rule ended, but because Spain made a defining choice. Unity would be built through religious uniformity. Jews were expelled. Muslims were forced to convert or leave. Faith became a tool of state power. The Spanish Inquisition emerged, enforcing belief through fear, control, and surveillance. At the same time, 1492 marked another turning point. Spain looked outward. Christopher Columbus sailed west, and Spain entered the age of empire. What began as exploration quickly turned into conquest. Vast territories in the Americas were claimed in the name of crown and faith. Gold and silver flowed into Spain. Indigenous civilizations were destroyed or reshaped. Christianity spread alongside violence. Spain became one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Empire transformed Spain's identity. Wealth created splendor, but also dependence. The empire was built on extraction, not sustainability. Faith justified domination. Power concentrated in the crown. Spain saw itself as the defender of Catholicism against Protestant Europe and the Islamic world. This belief fueled wars, expansion, and sacrifice. Spanish identity became tied to mission, religious, imperial, and moral. Yet beneath the surface, cracks appeared. Empire demanded constant war, resources were drained, inflation rose, innovation lagged behind other European powers. While Spain ruled vast lands abroad, internal inequality deepened. Peasants struggled, minorities were excluded, intellectual freedom was limited by religious control. Spain was powerful but fragile. Conflict became part of daily reality. Spain fought wars across Europe and the seas. It defended faith and empire simultaneously, often at great cost. And as centuries passed, the question grew louder. Was Spain serving its people or its image? This tension between belief and reality, glory and suffering, unity and exclusion, became a permanent feature of Spanish history. Faith had unified the nation, but it had also silenced difference. Empire had elevated Spain globally, but weakened it internally. The choices that created greatness also planted the seeds of decline. And yet, Spain did not disappear. It endured, it adapted, it carried memory forward. Because Spain's story is not simply one of conquest or faith, it is a story of identity shaped by conflict between religions, regions, ideas, and visions of the future. It is a land where belief runs deep, where history weighs heavily, and where contradictions coexist. And this is only the beginning. In the next part, we'll explore how Spain faced decline, internal division, and the long struggle between tradition and modernity, and how conflict continued shaping the Spanish soul. Chapter 2. As the weight of empire grew heavier, Spain began to feel the cost of its own ambition. The gold and silver arriving from the Americas created the illusion of endless wealth, but this wealth did not build a strong foundation. Instead of investing in industry, innovation, or education, much of it was spent on wars, palaces, and defending religious authority across Europe. Spain appeared powerful, yet beneath the surface its economy weakened, and dependence replaced development. The 17th century marked a slow but painful decline. While other European nations embraced new ideas, science, and trade, Spain remained deeply tied to tradition and religious control. The Inquisition continued to limit intellectual freedom. Questioning authority became dangerous. Creativity survived, but often in shadows. Artists and writers expressed brilliance, yet society as a whole resisted change. Spain began falling behind, not because it lacked talent, but because it feared transformation. Internally, Spain was never truly one unified voice. Regional identities remained strong. Castile dominated political power, while regions like Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Andalusia preserved distinct languages, traditions, and economic interests. These differences were often ignored or suppressed in the name of unity, creating long-term resentment. Spain's identity was declared singular but lived plural. Wars intensified these tensions. Conflicts drained resources and trust. When territories were lost and influence declined, Spain faced an identity crisis. It had defined itself through empire and faith, and now both were under pressure. The question became unavoidable. Who is Spain without empire? The 18th century brought attempts at reform. New rulers tried to modernize administration, reduce church control, and strengthen the state. Roads improved, education expanded slightly, but reform faced resistance from traditional elites who feared losing power. Progress arrived slowly, unevenly, and often too late. Spain was trying to catch up in a world that had already moved forward. Then came Napoleon. In the early 19th century, France invaded Spain, breaking the illusion of strength completely. The invasion was brutal and chaotic, but it awakened something powerful: popular resistance. Ordinary Spaniards rose against foreign rule, fighting not as an empire, but as a people. This conflict reshaped Spanish identity. Loyalty shifted from crown to nation. Suffering created solidarity. Spain was no longer just ruled, it was felt. After the war, instability followed. Spain struggled to define itself politically. Monarchy, liberalism, conservatism, and republican ideas clashed violently. Coups, revolutions, and civil unrest became common. The church remained influential, but its power was increasingly questioned. Faith still shaped life, but no longer controlled it completely. Spain entered a long period of internal conflict where no single vision of the future could dominate. Colonial losses deepened this crisis. By the end of the 19th century, Spain lost its last major overseas territories. The empire that once defined it was gone. What remained was a wounded pride and a deep sense of loss. Intellectuals, artists, and thinkers began questioning everything. They asked painful questions about failure, identity, and purpose. Spain turned inward, searching for meaning after greatness. Yet, decline did not erase culture. Spanish literature, philosophy, and art flourished in reflection. Pain became inspiration. The country began examining its contradictions honestly: faith versus freedom, unity versus diversity, memory versus progress. This self-examination was uncomfortable but necessary, and still, conflict did not disappear. Spain entered the 20th century divided and uncertain. Economic inequality remained extreme. Rural poverty contrasted sharply with urban change. Political ideologies hardened. Hope and fear coexisted. Spain was no longer an empire, but it had not yet become a stable modern nation either. This unresolved tension set the stage for one of the most traumatic chapters in Spanish history, a conflict that would tear families apart, silence voices, and leave scars that lasted generations. In the next part, we'll explore the Spanish Civil War, how ideology, faith, and fear collided, and how this conflict reshaped Spain's identity in ways still felt today. Chapter 3. The Spanish Civil War did not appear suddenly. It was the result of decades of unresolved tension, fear, and division. Spain had become a country where different visions of life could no longer coexist peacefully. On one side stood those who wanted deep social change: land reform, workers' rights, secular education, and a break from the old structures of power. On the other side stood those who feared that change would destroy order, faith, tradition, and national unity. Between them stood millions of ordinary people, pulled into a conflict they did not create but could not escape. When war erupted in 1936, it was brutal from the very beginning. It was not only a fight for political control, it was a fight over identity. What does it mean to be Spanish? Is Spain defined by tradition and Catholic faith, or by modern ideas and social equality? Can unity exist without uniformity? These questions were no longer debated, they were fought over. The war divided families, villages, and cities. Brothers fought brothers. Neighbors turned against each other. Violence did not remain on battlefields, it entered homes, churches, schools, and streets. Fear became constant. Trust disappeared. Spain fractured emotionally as much as politically. Faith played a central role in this conflict. For some, the church represented moral order and national identity. For others, it symbolized oppression and alliance with elite power. Churches were protected in some areas and burned in others. Religion, which had unified Spain in the past, now deepened division. It was no longer only belief, it was a position. Foreign powers watched closely and intervened indirectly. Spain became a testing ground for ideologies that would soon engulf Europe. Fascism, communism, and democracy collided on Spanish soil. Weapons arrived. Volunteers crossed borders. The world saw Spain not just as a country in crisis, but as a warning. When the war ended in 1939, Spain was exhausted and broken. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Many more were imprisoned, exiled, or silenced. General Francisco Franco emerged victorious and established a dictatorship that would last for decades. Peace returned, but it was the peace of fear, not reconciliation. Under Franco, Spain was unified by force. Political opposition was crushed. Regional languages and identities were suppressed. Public life was tightly controlled. Faith returned to the center of power, closely linked with the state. Order was restored, but at a heavy cost: freedom, expression, and memory. For many Spaniards, survival meant silence. Speaking openly about the past became dangerous. Families carried grief privately. Trauma was passed quietly from one generation to the next. The country moved forward physically, but emotionally it remained frozen in unresolved pain. And yet life continued. Spain slowly modernized despite repression. Infrastructure developed. Tourism grew. Cities expanded. Contact with the outside world increased. Beneath the surface, society was changing. New generations grew up connected to Europe, aware that Spain was different and could be different. Faith also changed its role. While still influential, it became less dominant in daily life, especially among younger people. Tradition remained present, but obedience weakened. Spaniards began imagining a future beyond fear. When Franco died in 1975, Spain stood at another crossroads. The dictatorship could have collapsed into chaos or revenge. Instead, something unexpected happened. Spain chose transition. Rather than reopening wounds violently, the country moved toward democracy through compromise. Political parties legalized, a constitution was written, elections were held, power shifted peacefully. It was not a perfect process, and it left many injustices unresolved, but it allowed Spain to breathe again. This transition reshaped Spanish identity deeply. For the first time in decades, Spaniards could speak, vote, and disagree openly. Regional identities re-emerged with strength. Catalan, Basque, and Galician cultures returned to public life. Spain accepted diversity not as a threat, but as a reality. Yet the past did not disappear. The memory of the Civil War and dictatorship remained sensitive. Silence protected peace, but also delayed healing. Questions of justice, accountability, and remembrance lingered. Spain learned how to move forward without fully looking back, a choice that brought stability, but also unresolved tension. Still, democracy changed everyday life. Creativity exploded. Art, cinema, literature, and music flourished. Spanish culture became expressive, experimental, and open. Madrid, Barcelona, and other cities transformed into spaces of freedom. Spain rejoined Europe not only politically but emotionally. Identity shifted again. Spain was no longer an empire, no longer a dictatorship. It was a modern European nation still learning to live with its contradictions. Faith remained important for some, distant for others. Unity existed alongside regional pride. Conflict softened into debate, but never fully disappeared. Spain's history had taught it a painful lesson. Suppressing difference creates explosion. Allowing dialogue creates tension, but also survival. And this lesson would be tested again and again in the modern era. In the next part, we'll explore contemporary Spain, its democracy, regional tensions, global role, and the ongoing struggle between memory and progress that continues shaping Spanish identity today. Chapter 4. As Spain settled into democracy, the country experienced a kind of awakening that was both exciting and unsettling. After decades of silence and control, voices returned everywhere at once. People spoke freely, argued openly, created boldly. Spain moved quickly to reconnect with Europe and the wider world, joining international institutions, opening its economy, and reshaping its public life. For many Spaniards, this period felt like breathing after holding air for too long. Cities transformed first. Madrid became a symbol of cultural freedom, energy, and experimentation. Art, music, cinema, and nightlife exploded with creativity. The famous cultural movement of the late 20th century reflected something deeper than fashion or rebellion. It reflected release. A generation that had grown up under restriction was now expressing everything at once: desire, humor, doubt, anger, and hope. Spain was rediscovering itself emotionally. At the same time, democracy brought old questions back into the open. Regional identity returned strongly, especially in Catalonia and the Basque Country. Languages that had been suppressed were spoken publicly again. Local traditions were reclaimed with pride. Autonomy became a central political idea. For some, this diversity felt like justice and recognition. For others, it felt like fragmentation and threat. Spain was learning once again that unity does not erase difference. It must learn to live with it. Faith also continued changing. Catholicism, once inseparable from state power, became more personal and less political. Churches remained part of daily life for many, but belief was no longer enforced or assumed. Younger generations questioned tradition more openly. Morality shifted from obedience toward choice. Spain did not abandon faith. It repositioned it. Religion became one voice among many, not the only one. Economically, Spain experienced both growth and vulnerability. Tourism became a major force, reshaping cities, coastlines, and daily rhythms. Millions came seeking sun, culture, and history. This brought opportunity, but also tension. Local life sometimes felt consumed by global demand. Housing, work, and identity were affected. Spain benefited from openness but paid a price in balance. The global financial crisis of the early 21st century exposed deep weaknesses. Unemployment soared, especially among young people. Trust in institutions dropped sharply. Many felt that progress had been promised but not protected. Protest movements grew, demanding dignity, fairness, and transparency. Democracy was not rejected. It was challenged to do better. Spaniards had learned to speak again, and they used that voice. Memory returned as a central issue. As time passed, silence around the civil war and dictatorship became harder to maintain. Families wanted recognition, victims wanted remembrance. Younger generations asked why history had been hidden. Spain faced a difficult choice: protect stability through forgetting, or seek healing through truth. This debate remains unresolved, but it reflects a deeper maturity, the understanding that peace without memory has limits. Spain's global identity also evolved. It was no longer a conquering empire or an isolated nation. It became a bridge between Europe and Latin America, between tradition and modernity, between past and future. Spanish language and culture traveled globally through music, film, sport, and digital life. Spain influenced without dominating. It shared rather than imposed. Yet conflict did not disappear. Political polarization intensified. Regional independence movements challenged national unity. Economic pressure tested social cohesion. Spain continued living with tension, not explosive, but constant. And perhaps this is part of its character now. Spain does not seek simplicity, it survives complexity. What holds the country together is not uniform belief or shared memory, but shared experience. Spaniards understand conflict, they understand disagreement, they understand loss, and they also understand celebration, connection, and life lived intensely. This emotional depth gives Spanish identity its particular strength. Spain today is not defined by one story. It is defined by many stories speaking at once. A nation shaped by faith that learned to question it, an empire that learned humility, a country divided by conflict that chose dialogue instead of collapse. These choices did not erase pain, but they allowed continuity. And continuity matters, because Spain's future depends on how it continues navigating difference between regions, generations, beliefs, and memories. The past cannot be undone. Empire, faith, and conflict are written deeply into the national soul. But they do not have to control the future. Spain has learned slowly and painfully that identity is strongest when it allows space. This brings us to the final reflection. Not about what Spain was, but about what Spain represents now. A nation shaped by struggle that continues choosing coexistence over domination, dialogue over silence, and becoming over certainty. In the final part, we'll bring the entire story together and reflect on what Spain's long journey teaches us about identity, memory, and the cost of unity built without understanding. Chapter 5. To understand Spain today, you have to accept one essential truth. Spain is a country shaped not by certainty, but by tension. Its identity was never calm or simple. It was forged through belief and doubt, unity and division, power and loss. And because of this, Spanish identity does not rest easily. It reflects, remembers, and argues with itself. Spain's long journey shows how faith can both unite and divide. Religion once gave Spain purpose, structure, and global ambition. It offered meaning and identity in a fragmented world. But when belief became a tool of control, it silenced difference and created fear. Spain learned painfully that faith imposed by force loses its soul. Today, belief remains present, but it no longer defines citizenship or loyalty. This shift did not weaken Spain, it humanized it. Empire taught Spain another lesson. Power can expand borders, but it cannot guarantee balance. Spain's empire brought wealth, influence, and global reach, yet it also created dependency and blindness. When empire disappeared, Spain was forced to look inward and ask who it was without dominance. That moment of loss became a turning point. It transformed pride into reflection, and reflection, though uncomfortable, allowed renewal. Conflict is perhaps the deepest mark on Spain's identity. Civil war, dictatorship, repression, these experiences left scars that time alone could not erase. Silence protected stability for a while, but it could not heal memory. Spain's strength today lies not in forgetting conflict, but in learning how to live with it without repeating it. Dialogue replaced violence. Debate replaced fear. Imperfection replaced illusion. Modern Spain is built on coexistence, not perfect coexistence, but conscious coexistence. Regions speak different languages, traditions vary, beliefs differ, and yet the country continues choosing negotiation over collapse. This choice is not accidental, it is learned through pain. Spain understands what happens when disagreement becomes war. Culture carries this memory forward. Spanish art, cinema, music, and literature often explore themes of identity, loss, desire, and contradiction. Expression is intense because history was intense. Celebration exists because suffering existed. Life is lived fully because silence once dominated. Spain does not hide emotion. It honors it. Spain's place in the world has also matured. It no longer seeks to dominate, convert, or expand. It seeks to connect, to share language, culture, and experience, to act as a bridge rather than a center. This humility is not weakness. It is wisdom earned through history. The future of Spain depends on its relationship with memory, not memory as accusation, but memory as understanding. A country that remembers honestly can choose differently. Spain's challenge is not to agree on one version of the past, but to allow space for many truths without fear. And this challenge reflects a broader human lesson. Identity built on exclusion eventually collapses. Identity built on dialogue survives. Spain's story shows us that unity forced through silence creates fracture, while unity built through recognition creates resilience. Spain is not finished. It is still becoming, still negotiating, still balancing faith and freedom, unity and diversity, past and future. And perhaps this is its quiet strength. Spain does not pretend to have final answers. It lives with questions. From empire to reflection, from faith to choice, from conflict to coexistence, Spain's journey reminds us that identity is not something we inherit perfectly. It is something we build carefully again and again. And in that careful building, Spain continues.